I think that, again, the not to somewhat agree with the premise of it, but it's not news when, say, in London, there's someone gets stabbed and it's two ethnic minorities. But if, say, a child or someone completely innocent gets stabbed in London, well, then that is news. And it's that same sort of concept, but extrapolated elsewhere. And I think that it might not necessarily be an indictment of it. It's just saying, well, this seems to be what's popular.
It seems well, yeah, obviously the needle was tipped very much the other way in recent years, and we can see this, for example, with all the machete attacks that go completely underreported in London at the moment. But we do have the I suppose the distinction there is what you're trying to articulate is a culture clash rather than just a pure racial crime. So if it's localized to a neighborhood, like stabbings in Brixton are not that big a news. We've covered them when drill rappers have slashed each other up before, but just to say, get out of that culture. But the media overlooks it because it's expected of that little locality. Whereas if you had another London riots, for example, and it leaked into back there where I lived, which is, London suburbs, not that violent, not that built up, then that would still be shown. They'd still be running interference for it, saying that looting is reparations and some nonsense like that, but they would actually have to show it. And then in the inverse, you see the police brutality stories always blown up, their headline coverage all the time, or the January 6th attacks, which are predominantly white and attack on democracy. That's why I'm saying it is very much an inversion of at least the racial dynamic that she's putting forward, because the news media will not want to show specifically minority on white crime. It will be definitely the other way around.
Yeah, there's certainly more of an incentive to do that these days, but I think that the innate interest of people who live in nice areas of crime from the less well-off areas creeping in, which tends to be along racial lines, let's be honest. That I don't think that concern is going to go away no matter what politics you have, because people are concerned for their own safety, and when their safety is in question, well, politics kind of goes out the window a little bit. And I think that although I'm not agreeing with how they frame it in the film, I think there is something there to that. Like when I watch the news, if a really nice place, like a country village, has a stabbing, I'm just like, well, what went wrong here? If it happens in London, I'm not thinking, oh, what was that person's motivation?
Yeah, it's part and parcel of living in a big city, as Sidney Khan would say. Well, it's like the Linton on News story was so massive here. For our American viewers that don't know, there was a little town in Yorkshire, probably about a population of about 1,000 people, and they were going to put about 3,000 asylum seekers on their doorstep. The place had one village shop and a church, and that's it. So it was just, they were going to be invaded. It was going to be colonisation. And it was so atypical. Whereas down the road in Swindon or anywhere in London, they're building specific hotels just to house them with the Channel migrants who have come across illegally, for example. So, yeah, you don't report on it as much because it becomes the norm. You're the frogs in a boiling pot that have been lobotomised so they don't jump out.
But then reporting on the exceptions, of course, is an interesting media strategy that is somewhat examined here, not directly, but it's suggesting that they're cherry picking news that does the best for ratings, not what's the most representative.
The best and clearest way that I can phrase it to you, Lou, to capture the spirit of what we air, is think of our newscast as a screaming woman running down the street with her throat cut.
Which, you can understand why they're doing it, because of course they are a business, they are trying to make profit, but it raises the question about the news media in general. Of course, there's the confrontation with the one voice of morality, and Nina about the story of the break-in where Lou finds all of the bodies, and he's just like, well, they found cocaine in the property, so it seems like it's a drug story, so it's not really that interesting. And she's just like, well, we can wait until we've reported on this. So she's trying to squeeze out as much sensationalism as possible.
Joel's got a source on the task force who says they found drugs at the Granada Hills house. Cocaine in wrapped packages, hidden in crawl spaces, over 50 pounds, and he confirmed it with an investigator at the scene. It wasn't a home invasion, it was a drug robbery.
Give it to the Noon crew.
This is news.
It detracts from the story.
It is the story.
The story is urban crime creeping into the suburbs. That's the story.
Jesus, you sound like Lou.
To get ratings over actually reporting on the truth.
Yeah, we can omit facts to formulate a narrative.
And it makes it very clear and explicit that that's the direction they're going down, and they make that moral conflict very clear and obvious that that's going on. And again, this ties into the incentive structures that I was talking about in the media that it presents really well. Why people become immoral in the first place. They don't necessarily start off that way, but as time goes on, they come into contact with people like Lou, who slowly twist their arm to go in that direction, which I think is what happens to Nina.
Yeah.
In that she'd already had what seems like a long career. So it seems strange that once she's sort of made a name for herself, that she's changing her approach. I think that is the influence of Lou, and it changes her view on things. She becomes far more ruthless and more mercenary-like, which is interesting because normally when people come into contact with psychopaths in most media, it's more of a horror story, really, isn't it? It's them trying to escape their orbit, not necessarily them trying to emulate parts of their personality to get their own success, which is what happens here, which is quite a novel representation otherwise.
Yeah, well, the greatest indictment of news as well is the fact that Lou wins. He's incredibly successful. He expands his business. He gets away with killing his co-partner, and he's doing gangbuster ratings. And so the critique that it presents of the news in this film is very interesting because it doesn't provide any alternative solutions. Obviously, we think, for example, that a plurality of voices to constantly challenge other media narratives, as you do in Contemplations, as we all both do on The Daily Show, is the best way to go about it. But those avenues are being increasingly closed off by Silicon Valley, for example. I mean, look at YouTube's new terms of service. Navigating those is a linguistic minefield and has been many times. You know, we even got a temporary ban for a Coronation Clip Street the other day, which was insane. But then lots of people turn around and say, okay, the profit incentive itself is the problem. But then if you look at state-owned broadcasters in Canada, or specifically the BBC over here, that doesn't help either.
That makes it even worse in a way, because then they have multiple incentives to lie.
Yeah.
They have not only the incentive to, get good ratings, to be popular, although it might not be as for profit. They also have the incentive of staying on the good side of the government or the whoever they're representing.
Yeah, it becomes hegemonic. You have a total lack of accountability from your viewing audience if they're forced to pay for you via their forcibly extracted taxes, and you're ripe for ideological capture. So anything that reinforces the continued existence of an aristocratic media class becomes the dominant culture within the institution. And we can see that with June Sarpong from the BBC, for example, being paid hundreds of thousands of pounds a year for 3 days of work a week for diversity management, and all that is hiring her mates. So that was also very interesting as well. The newsroom was unanimously white as well, which would not be the case nowadays. So other than the Asian woman who presents it. Yeah.
I think that it was trying to present an era of news media that wasn't reflected in the time in which it was set a little bit. I think that whoever they consulted for the film or whatever they based it on, it must have been at least 30 years ago.
Yeah, out of date, definitely. But the only thing that wasn't out of date actually was the Lou and Nina dynamic, which we've already spoken about I don't know what you'd call it, sexual harassment, leveraging sexual favors to retain her contract, because that was happening at the time. There's been disputes about Bombshell, for example, the news about Fox News and Roger Ailes and all that, and Bill O'Reilly being somewhat accurate. But there's loads of reports, and I've linked a few in the description, I'm sure, or Matt Lauer at NBC, who had a button on his desk to lock women into his office, and, kept buying them sex toys and weird things like this. This was rampant in the news media, and that's across both sides of the aisle as well. That's across at the time, Bush supporting 9/11 is the excuse for the Iraq War hegemon, and then the liberal establishment, who were, I suppose you could say, on the side of the BLM rioters up until very recently, until BLM, well, no, they don't want to talk about it because BLM are currently infighting over lawsuits, and Kanye West was right about that. So the only thing that is definitely very accurate is the pernicious culture of creepy dudes leveraging the incentive structures to sexually harass women.
It does make sense as well, because these people have had to climb the rungs, and therefore to succeed you have to be that way inclined. You have to be a bit higher in the dark triad, which makes sense why they're doing these sorts of immoral things. And it's one of those depressing facts where, particularly where you're in media, where it can appeal to narcissism you might get lots of people gravitating towards it. It's like clinical psychopaths and being surgeons. Like they gravitate towards it.
Really?
You didn't know that?
Thing. No, I didn't know.
Well, it's their predisposition helps them with the job they're doing. If you don't feel any empathy or you don't care about the feelings of the person you're cutting up, it makes you a better surgeon because you're more objective about what you're doing, and they might actually take some amount of pleasure in it, whereas a lot of other people might be thinking, oh, I really don't want to get this wrong because there's a person there, I'm going to feel really bad about it. I know I certainly would feel like that, which is probably why I'd be ill-suited to do that.
Well, we both have really high disgust sensitivity as well, and that is typically a marker of conservative temperament. So do you reckon, I mean, obviously Lou in here decides to reposition dead bodies and get up close and personal with it and actually kills people at some point.
He makes an explicit point of, towards the end when he's hired his own crew, he says, I'm not going to ask you to do anything that I wouldn't do.
I can tell you from experience that the surest way up the ladder is to listen carefully and follow my orders. You may be confused at times and other times unsure. But remember, I will never ask you to do anything that I wouldn't do myself.
Yeah.
Which is like we know what he's done.
Yes.
And it's all pretty horrific. So he's going to ask them to do all of these nasty things.
Yeah. So with a surgeon's proclivity towards being unfazed by gore and the news media's proclivity being
to film it.
Yeah, to film it and also have no moral prohibitions against showcasing it on primetime television. Do you think that might also be one of the reasons why both those institutions seem to lean politically left these days, particularly pushing for state funding as well?
I don't know. It's a very complicated thing. I mean, it's certainly possible, but I wouldn't want to say anything for certain because I don't know enough about the industries in question to say yes categorically. I know it's that.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.